House of Representatives passed the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act earlier this week. It is a bipartisan measure that requires the Department of Education to use the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which says anti-Semitism is in part, quote, a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred. The definition includes denying Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that Israel is a racist state. Joining us now to discuss the new bill is congressional reporter at The Hill, Mychael Schnell. Good morning, Michael. Thanks for joining us, and let's get right into it. There has been some criticism, particularly from conservatives, against this bill. They claim that it potentially infringes on the First Amendment right to free speech. Can you walk us through a little bit about where the battle lines were drawn on this piece of legislation?
Yeah. Hey, guys. Good morning. This piece of legislation passing with an overwhelming bipartisan majority, but there was a contingent of conservatives and of progressive Democrats who actually ended up voting against this. I believe it was 70 conservatives and 21 Democrats who voted against this legislation. And essentially their argument was that the Holocaust organization's definition of anti-Semitism was too broad. And a number of these lawmakers, as you mentioned, Amber, raised concerns about free speech being infringed on, free speech on college campuses being chilled. This obviously comes on the backdrop of those explosive pro-Palestinian protests happening on college campuses across the nation. So this was one of the reasons why we saw the House vote on it this week. But ultimately it passed with bipartisan majorities. But it was very interesting to see that band of conservatives and progressives vote against it because of those concerns over free speech.
We had a powerful video released by Bernie Sanders. It's becoming more popular that members of Congress are releasing these videos onto the internet to, say their views to the public. But he talked about how he doesn't believe it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. This is someone who's a Jewish man whose parents, migrated to the U.S., to Brooklyn because of World War II, of the Holocaust, to escape persecution. Now, it seems to me that the lines were drawn in who voted for what, along who's taking a lot of this money from the pro-Israel lobby, from AIPAC and groups like AIPAC. What do you make of how these lines were drawn? Do you see it as who's taking lobbying money from these pro-Israel groups?
Yeah, so I haven't dove into the specifics about the lobbying efforts behind these lawmakers and who's receiving money from what. But I'll tell you that in terms of the Democratic Party, we've seen the Democrats, particularly House Democrats, be fractured on this issue of Israel for months since Hamas launched that attack on Israel on October 7th, beginning this war between the two entities. And it's because we've seen pro-Israel, Jewish, a lot of them Jewish Democrats being pitted against those pro-Palestinian progressive lawmakers who have raised real concerns about the mounting humanitarian deaths in the Gaza Strip. And this clash between Democrats is something that we have seen at every juncture, at every turn of this war against Hamas. So I think that as we continue to see these pieces of legislation related to the Israel-Hamas war being brought to the House floor and voted on, we're going to continue to see that divide within House Democrats because this is such an explosive issue that really pits the party against one another.
There's also an element here of the Christian individuals in Congress opposing this because the IHRA's working definition of anti-Semitism also includes the phrase or the example of claims of Jews killing Jesus. So Matt Gaetz, for example, said that he would not vote for this because it basically criminalizes what's written in the Bible. So are there perhaps nonprofit Christian organizations or churches coming out against this bill as well?
I am not aware of any of that. I've sort of been focusing on the legislative aspect of it, the political ramifications of it. But we did see that argument from Matt Gaetz, from Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, again, getting into this idea of chilling free speech. So it's a very fascinating bill that was brought to the floor because we had a whole number of camps coming out against it for their different and personal reasons.
It's very interesting, the parallels that are being drawn between what's going on college campuses and the media and Congress's response to the Vietnam War. So you had students protesting, they were deemed communist or anti-American. You had them saying, well, actually, we're not on the side of America in this war. We believe that American intervening in Vietnam is threatening the self-determination of South Vietnam. And similarly, you have a lot of these students saying, well, we're threatening the self-determination of Palestinians by supporting Israel. There's just so many parallels here. And of course, this was something that followed the civil rights movement and free speech movement then. Do you see that, these tensions are at play once again, and that deeming these protests anti-Semitism could one day be treated the same way we treated Vietnam War protesters, as anti-American?
I mean, I think that there's no doubt that a number of these protests have taken an anti-Semitic turn. You can see some of the signs that are brought at these protests on college campuses, calling for Jewish students to go home, for the destruction of the Jewish state. That is anti-Semitic in nature, so I don't think there's any question there. But in terms of the parallels, I think that it really raises, the idea that college campuses is a location where you really see a lot of Americans become very devout about their feelings, and we see these explosive protests happening on college campuses across the country. This is sort of, it's where we are seeing the American electorate become very impassioned and very into the current news, the current situation that is at play around the globe. Now, in terms of how this can play out, in terms of the election and how young voters are going to react at the ballot box come November, that is going to be another very interesting thing at play. But I think this all gets back to the fact that, students on college campuses, when they use their voice, they can really get a lot of attention and draw a lot of headlines.
Mychael, some of the individuals who are advocating for this bill and have defended its passage have pointed out that every president since Obama has used the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. So they're basically saying this doesn't really change anything. It just codifies that definition into the rules and regulations that are made basically at the Department of Education. Can you talk a little bit about the previous, legislative history of similar definitions of anti-Semitism? And then second, what has Biden said about this bill, and what has been his involvement in perhaps helping to pass this through Congress?
Yeah, sure. To my knowledge, the president has not weighed in on this bill yet, but we did see the Senate try to take it up this week, though that was then paused because there were folks said that there were some concerns on both sides of the aisle about it. So we'll have to see if the Senate can, take it up and get that passed. And then, of course, it would go to the president's desk when it's up to him to see if he supports it or not. I mean, the fact that House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries supported it, I think that's a good sign that the president may. But of course, we don't know until we get the official position from there. But yeah, in terms of the definition, some folks saying that this bill was redundant. That is an argument that we heard from a number of lawmakers. Some folks saying that, anti-Semitism is already illegal. It's already not allowed. It's already enforced in anti-discrimination laws. So we don't need this Holocaust organization's definition to be codified. But at the end of the day, again, it did pass with a wide bipartisan majority. So we'll have to see its fate in the Senate and then in the White House.
Do you see in either direction, whether it's, restricting the amount of militarized police on campus or increasing it to quell the protests, do you see any legislation being passed to regulate the protests going on across college campuses?
There hasn't been chatter about that. The one legislative avenue that's sort of been brought up a number of times is potentially cutting off federal funding for some of these colleges and universities that do not harbor a safe environment for Jewish students. This is something that we first heard Speaker Mike Johnson float when he was at Columbia University, speaking to the protesters, telling them to pack up, go home, calling on the university president to resign. We've heard it from a number of other Republican lawmakers as well. But whether or not that comes to fruition, we'll have to see.
Yeah, and there's been a couple of federal complaints, and I don't obviously know if you're tracking this, so no worries if not, but a nonprofit legal organization filed a civil rights complaint against Northwestern after it announced plans to give scholarships exclusively to Palestinian students. And then on the opposite side, Columbia University, some students there, pro-Palestinian students, filed a civil rights complaint over the treatment of protesters. Is there any movement or chatter in Congress on some of those issues in terms of, you mentioned that there are some moves to defund universities that have not properly quelled some of the protests, but has there been any movement in the other direction by perhaps progressive lawmakers to have legislation addressing the protection perhaps of some of the pro-Palestinian protesters?
Yeah, again, there hasn't been chatter to my knowledge of that up on the Hill. Really, this week it was talk about that anti-Semitism resolution and then sort of this floating of potentially cutting off federal funding for some of those colleges and universities.
All right, Mychael Schnell, thank you so much for joining us this morning on Rising.
Thanks, guys.